Tonight on Arming Main Street Radio.
The earth is absolutely flat. Kyrie said it, so it's got to be true.
The gang makes some new formatting choices.
We're coming to you remotely today,
which include podcast best practices.
Subscribe, like, comment, please.
Kendall, where can we find you on Twitter?
You can't.
Discussing topics people actually care about.
And we have lizard overlords, absolutely.
Now that actually is true. That I'll...
No, I've seen Tom Cruise take his skin off before. It's legit.
God. So.
And pre-episode preparation.
All right, I'm dropping the ball. What's our topic? I'm gonna just roll into it.
Okay.
Beautiful. Okay. Well, I'm Kendall. That's Connor. We're coming to you remotely today from different locations. Yeah. So what are we talking about today, Connor? What are we getting into?
All right, Kendall. So we were supposed to talk about this last week. I sort of dropped the ball a bit with all this travel. But basically, I had read sort of a Gallup poll on Twitter that was talking about our generation and its trust in institutions. And, our age group has something like a 73%, disapproval or distrust in, sort of these traditional institutions like our government, the media, all the people that are supposed to keep us informed and, on track for different stuff as a society. We tend not to believe that they're actually acting in good faith. There are a couple other bullet points that are a little more specific, but for comparison, the boomer generation, it's more like 75% of them do trust, the news outlets, the media's, sort of the more institutionalized policy centers and stuff. So I wanted to talk about that with the backdrop of fake news, with the backdrop of marketing versus propaganda, and sort of kind of like, the social media tech bubble, influence on the deterioration of trust in institutions.
Gotcha. All right. Well, I think it'll be good to kind of couch this in that we can give a little bit of theory here as to why we think boomers might trust institutions more than our generation. My take, just instinctually, is the fact that one generation grew up without the internet. That was it. Like, you had local news, and that's the other thing. So no internet and a very, very, very strong local news infrastructure, right? And that helped create a situation where, where else are you going to find things out that are happening in your town or nationally? Whereas our generation, and this will get into fake news and things like that, well, the internet just changed a lot, where now I can read the New York Times. So people don't really read their local papers, right? They read the strong national papers. Plus, maybe they're not reading at all. Maybe I'm just an old man. I still read the Wall Street Journal, right? So now a lot of people are getting their news from Twitter and Facebook, which I'm just going to come off top rope and just say, I think it's utterly asinine. I think it's ridiculous. Completely.
I have to push back a little bit. I'm one of those people that only gets their news through Twitter. To be fair, though, like, I've spent a lot of time and years curating, a group of, I want to say, well-informed, highly opinionated people from a diverse set of backgrounds. And I don't mean that necessarily in the DEI way, just more so in the, different academic backgrounds, disciplines, fields that they're working in, also all sorts of, personal backgrounds and identity-related backgrounds as well, mostly because, that's how I like to keep informed. Because these are people whose faces and names I trust because I see them as experts in what it is they're doing. And when they venture out of their expertise, I still really much enjoy their perspective and opinion because obviously they represent a group of individuals that I respect. So, I don't necessarily think that this decentralization of news and information is an awful thing or asinine, but I do think it is dangerous in the fact that like it took me years to cultivate the feed that I have. That's not necessarily the case with most people.
So I think part of the reason I came off the top rope like that is one, once again, I'll restate for the record, I am an old man. I don't understand Twitter. I think it's ridiculous. I do. I simply think I don't want to be kind of too much of a curmudgeon, but I don't think you can get across really, really nuanced things in tweets. And so I guess I'll walk it back a little bit and say it's not asinine. I prefer to get my news, even if it's just like an opinion, in an op-ed with research, right? And paragraphs versus, you know, long tweets or 5 or 6 tweets, kind of a thing. But I agree with you. Like, you can curate a really awesome news source for yourself backed with experts, but the problem is, and this kind of gets into my, sort of rules and regulations thing where it's uncontrollable and most people will not take that time. Therefore, I tend to look at social media, at least Twitter in this case, for news, and especially Facebook with the algorithms that they use, as just damaging. Like, there are some redeeming qualities, but you really got to work for them versus just in the old days, it was like, here's my local paper. Now there's issues with that too, which I'm sure
Right.
you'll point out, but yeah, it's, I guess for me, I don't see social media as a news source because it's unregulatable in a way, which I guess could have its benefits in that you can get the news unfiltered, but I think just what the eye test has told us over the last 5, 6 years is that that's just not what happens typically.
I mean, if we could just make it like Wikipedia, I don't know, that seems like a viable option to me. Crowdsourced, crowdfunded, and then like crowd regulated.
And that idea gets back to what we always talk about, right? Where blockchain is sort of this tool for decentralizing, but also creating trust amongst people where trust would otherwise be missing. But Kendall, I appreciate your hot take because that's what this show is all about, is hot takes, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, don't walk back the asinine because I love it, love the love the line in the sand, honestly. But I guess I should expound upon what I was saying too. Is tweet threads are definitely a source of a lot of information. It really drives home points pretty effectively in my opinion. For topics that might be more cut and dry. But when it gets to nuance, you're absolutely right. It takes the long form content to really delve into it. And most of the people I follow they're mostly giving commentary on current events and linking to long form articles. So I am going deeper than the clickbait headlines. Right. But again, that's kind of probably where I differ from most people. And I recognize that and see how, when you're dealing with these social media algorithms that are essentially a black box to anyone except for a data scientist like myself, or a programmer with your background or expertise, people are just going to go right over their head and not even realize that to some extent they're being manipulated, not maliciously, but as a direct result of advertising incentives and echo chambers that kind of come around from the fact that your social media network is a reflection of yourself and your personal network. So if you really only expose yourself to a certain set of individuals, backgrounds, viewpoints, it's really, really just going to reinforce those things to you. Right. And you would have to actively challenge your beliefs or backgrounds in order to get anything that isn't, confirmatory or I don't know what the word is here, but that doesn't reinforce your worldview.
Yeah, I think so. I'll kind of pick up on that thread and stick with me here because there's another point I want to make about that disconnect between trusted institutions. I I think one, exactly what you're saying is the algorithms enforce tunnel vision in the sense that you're only going to get content that is already sort of where you want to be, or maybe you were kind of adjacently interested in something and looked it up, right?
Mm-hmm.
I may or may not have researched Mercedes Benz the other day because I saw a commercial. I was like, the Mercedes looks dope. Let's see what it is about. And now everything I see is Mercedes Benz. Like every advertisement box is Mercedes, right? So
And as a
there,
former Google Ads expert, I would tell you that makes you in their affinity group for luxury cars, specifically the Mercedes-Benz.
yeah. So there's that aspect of it. I think the other aspect of it, when we think about trust in institutions, is an overall lack of trust in government, right? And
Mm-hmm.
media is admittedly separate for the most part from government. But if you think about the world our grandparents grew up in, which is the New Deal, right? The federal government saying, hey, we're recreating the social contract, right? We're going to make Social Security and things like that. Our parents sort of follow that up and come out of that. And even for my folks, like the 60s, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
getting civil rights legislation and things like that. So you can see why that trust would be there in
Mm-hmm.
the sense that there were tangible changes to people's lives. That is all but gone. And I know my conservative folks won't like this, but it really kind of starts with Ronald Reagan. I mean, where he's just like, nope, government's the problem. It's always been the problem, right? And the deregulating of things and the cutting of programs like Pell Grants and stuff like that, that starts to erode social trust. And now we've reached a place where people don't trust their government. So then, if folks don't trust their government, why are they going to trust news sources about that very same government? And that also gets into polarization, which is another topic, but
Yeah.
everybody is now siloed, right, based on whatever political persuasion they have. And so now that further segregates media, right? Where it's like,
Mm-hmm.
okay, I either watch CNN or I watch Fox News, and I'm not cross shopping those. It's not the Mercedes with the Audi. You just all Mercedes in that way.
We're gonna have to do a super cut of Kendall car references on this podcast.
Sorry,
Well,
I've been in that rabbit hole for a bit. My bad.
I
no,
guess the spin-off show at this point, Kendall and his cars.
We need a car talk reboot. For sure.
once this show blows up, we'll do a crib style introduction, right?
There we go.
Kendall's garage. But getting back to the topic a little bit, right? You mentioned basically Reagan is sort of this pivotal moment, but for me, honestly, that moment kind of starts even earlier than that in the 60s, right? And a lot of the trust in the institutions or lack thereof is actually from the generation before the boomers who kind of lead the social justice movement of the 60s. And that whole movement was founded on the fact that essentially our government isn't operating in our best interests, and that we don't have faith in these institutions to act in our good faith, right? And I see Reagan more as reactionary to the liberalism of the 60s as opposed to driving this cultural force. And if we look at the political divides, I think that that really starts to happen with Newt Gingrich in sort of like the 60s and 70s. I think it's the 70s actually, with some of the filibusters and different aspects that he introduces. But like you said, different topic, different conversation. But just I think my 2 cents is like, more so not necessarily who's responsible for the lack of trust in institution, but more about the waning and resurgence of trust in institutions during various time periods. And maybe more so just like the subsections of individuals who have trust in institutions at any given time is maybe more reflective of the people in power than it is necessarily of just blind trust in institutions. But, part of that is like, yeah, there was pretty much just only local news and 3 gatekeepers of national news. Whereas today, we've got endless options for gatekeepers of national news, and who's got time to figure out which one's legit and which one's just a troll?
Yeah, and I think so. One, I think those are good points, and we can kind of. I want to come back to that what Ronald Reagan kind of means and that pivot point in another episode one of these days, because that's a really good topic, and I think you make some really great points. Actually, you kind of changed my opinion on that. But moving on, I think that kind of gets us into the fake news conversation, right? Because, like you said, there are now any number of gatekeepers of national news, and there isn't. We live in a post truth world where Americans have done this weird thing where my individual rights now say the truth can be whatever I want it to be. The sun is purple, and that's my right to say the sun is purple and believe the sun is purple. So that's what I'm doing, right?
But the Earth definitely is flat, though.
Yeah, right? Like the earth is absolutely flat. Kyrie said it, so it's got to be true.
And we have lizard overlords, absolutely.
Now that actually is true. That
No, I've seen Tom Cruise take his skin off before. It's legit.
God. So there's that sort of aspect to things, right? Where we've so leaned into this individualism that now we are struggling to agree on a single source of just what is the truth, right? Through facts and data and what we observe with our own 2 eyes. So because of that, people are very susceptible to fake news, right?
Right.
Because you get, like we were talking about earlier, kind of bringing it all together a little bit to talk about this topic, you get silos, people in their own silos, algorithms reinforcing those silos, and then within them, there is no objective truth that we all agree on. And so now, especially in conservative circles, I would say, but not just conservative circles, but that is what comes to my mind. You get just things that simply are not true.
So part of me wants to go back a little earlier, basically to the emergence of marketing. And this was a book I actually read, I want to say back in January, but it's by Edward Bernays, who is the nephew of Sigmund Freud. So smart family, definitely in the psychology field. His book was called Propaganda, and it's a cornerstone in marketing, right? Because the only difference between propaganda and marketing is more marketing. We rebranded propaganda as marketing after the Nazis kind of destroyed the word with their minister of propaganda, Heinrich Goebbels. But at the end of the day, it's just about how do we get a messaging across to a group of individuals such that they take action in a manner in which that's favorable to us. So the book talks a lot about like the 1930s and 1950s, the early days of, advertising, pre-Mad Men, really, and the partnerships between brands and, institutions of trust, right? This is the first time we really see our institutions of trust being broken down and sold for goods and products. Doctors endorsing, cigarettes and different types of products that have no basis in medicine or science, but, that we're getting these institutional trusts or backing saying, hey, don't worry about this, it's fine. And, change it from propaganda to marketing doesn't really matter in terms of what you call it. But at the end of the day, the reason why I bring this up is you have to almost look at, the media outlets in terms of what are their incentives, how do they actually operate? And then, how does that ripple and cause effects in our politics and society? And to me, what I know to be true, right? And if anything, these social media networks have really exposed the danger of this, is that, media, news, journalism is incredibly dependent upon eyeballs, and not just, quick eyeballs, but eyeballs that are sticky and stay on their content for a long period of time. And, growing up, for the boomers or for our parents or whomever, the way that they got this across was basically through the negative news cycle, where we talk about kind of all the dangerous things happening and why you should be scared and worried. And it really allows you to then change the state at which you deliver news to people. And, in essence, are able to inform them of a prescriptive viewpoint, really, that is backed by, whoever's really paying for it. And I think that, with the addition of Fox News in the 90s, I think that's when they launched their cable news network. The entire mission was to combat the liberal media bias, which is a reflection of the fact that the only people really becoming journalists are what conservatives think of burnout hippies who can't get a real job because they were English majors, right? There's not a lot of conservative viewpoints.
Casimir Stone.
Accurate. What can I say?
But yeah, so they create this news network that is designed to be fair and balanced, or so they market themselves as. And there's a new viewpoint being reinforced that's opposite of the traditional media outlets, and you see this exaggerate even further once we get into social media and the hyper niche and the hyper local, because the level of targeting available on advertising allows you to drive people to extremely niche far out sites. That's how we get to the QAnon conspiracy theories. That's how we get to some of these other, I want to say the Goldwater is a random conservative news site that's run by some dude in Thailand who is an American, an expat, but he seems to be working with QAnon and be trying to push some sort of agenda in terms of news outlet. And you see that there's networks of these sites out there, right? And it's this combination of media and news with marketing and manipulation that to me is devaluing trust in institutions. But obviously this is like a big kind of networked rant that I don't know how to distill very well, because there's so many moving parts and pieces going on here.
I mean, ultimately, it comes down to the fact that media, CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, those national sort of channels, it's about making money, right? Mm-hmm. Which is why, when protests are happening and 99% of the protests are peaceful, what was on CNN for 2 weeks? Like looting and burning. 99%, everybody just walking, hanging out. Where's the camera going? Because they know that sensationalism and outrage get eyeballs, like you were saying, and that makes money. I think that, exactly. And the other piece to that is you've got them wanting to make money through clickbait, through just eyeballs, and the fact that the internet has created, in effect, the internet supercharges capitalism in the sense that how many jobs have been created just around you building a brand, either of yourself or of a thing, that then can sell to other people, period. YouTubers, how do they make money? Ads and sponsorships. Instagram influencers, how do they make money? Ads, sponsorships, right? Like everything is built to try to get you to spend your money on something. And for most people that's effective. Like I know for a fact susceptible to those very, very nice and thoughtfully curated Instagram ads. They get me. All right. So it's kind of one of those things where sensationalism gets eyeballs, and then overarchingly marketing in general and advertising in general now is about, or jobs have been created to sell you sort of lifestyles and ideals of yourself. So you kind of get the combination of that, and the lines between those blur, especially once you inject Facebook and Twitter, right? Because Facebook and Twitter, how do they make money? Ads, especially Facebook, all ads, right? Okay, so then if I build an algorithm that can sort of curate ads that I think you are likely to want, okay, now we're on to something. And so basically the problem comes down to, like with so many things in our society, everybody wants to make money and they don't really care about the consequences of what's going on in the making of that money, right?
So I got two. I don't even know. One question and one, I guess, like pushback or point to it. I guess is that oftentimes, yes, ads are all about selling you something, right? But sometimes they're just selling you an idea or a concept.
Yeah, I think
because
that counts.
okay,
Yeah.
and I think part of that is that like it in the past, right, like these large national organizations that deliver news through their media brand are controlled by, usually a single family or, couple of families, right? There's
Right.
the Fox News is are they Australians, British, whatever they are, but that the Murdochs, right? And then, CNN is the Turner Broadcasting family. And I think that's, one guy, the Turner family or whatever.
Right.
But in MSNBC, I don't really know. I'm pretty sure that's just a large public conglomerate. But, at the end of the day, there is some sort of editorial review process and a gatekeeping aspect, right? That many of these, national brands kind of go through before they'll bring you news or information. Where social media exploits or highlights the fact that there's no longer these gatekeepers in the way, and that you can use the advertising, system to build a audience, build a brand, and it sort of exploit these algorithms to shape other people's opinions or worldview by, testing messaging and seeing what works on different groups of people by breaking them down to different demographics and identities and testing that messaging very literally, and looking at the stats or the back, the data that sees how effective these advertising campaigns are at either driving people to their websites to read the news articles or, create some sort of change or action in real life. But I guess, do you think that like prior to the advent of the internet and social media, we were better off with these, few specific institutional gatekeepers of information and a more cohesive national narrative, even if it was the Fox CNN division, than sort of like the sporadic chaos we now see on social media? Do you think that this devolving into more decentralized news media sources has really made the problem significantly worse? I mean, that's a little bit of a leading question, but I guess my question is, what are your thoughts on this? Because like I see again pros and cons to both situations.
I think I would agree with that last statement. There are pros and cons to both situations. Um, Here's how I look at boomers and the generation before them. I think they're called the silent generation, right? Or are they the greatest generation? Those two generations, boomers and their parents, let's say. So like 1930 to 1960, like everybody being born in those time periods. I think what you see first is um, there is an era and a sort of social cohesion that makes that first sort of national pre-internet sort of 1, 2, 3 gatekeepers work, which is that the only people who have power are white and male, right? Beautiful. Every time I look around, yeah, there are people who might not look like me in this society, but everybody who can say something, it looked like me. Perfect. You start to lose that, right? As other groups gain political power. So I think you start to see the fraying of that social cohesion. Um, and so bring on the internet decades later, and I think what happens is it just kind of pours fuel on the fire that's already there. So it's fascinating because essentially what has happened is social media, unfortunately, and I don't think it was its intended purpose at all, kind of just is used as a grab bag for horrible things. And for groups of people who we wish did not know that there were others like them now to get together, right? And I just, that's just kind of what it is. So I think ultimately, in a multiracial society, you would maybe want I still think the best model is well, I won't even call it centralized truth, an adherence to the truth, whatever that may be, right? And then outlets reporting on that, preferably local news outlets, strong local news outlets, because they're easily held accountable. Like if the Free Press for Detroit said that so and so was committing fraud, right? Maybe the mayor is committing fraud or something insane is happening, and then we see that to not be true. Well, we can hold them accountable. I can't hold Fox News accountable. You know what I mean? Like it's hard.
How can we hold Detroit news more accountable than Fox News?
I mean, because back then newspapers made money by people putting ads in the paper, right? And subscribing. Well, you get rid of all of that. And
well,
I would
that's what the
argue
internet is.
I would argue that all of that has just been gutted. Yeah, that is what the internet is, but they've just been weakened to a point where nobody cares anymore. You know what I mean? Like there has to be that this is my local news outlet and I really care that they're doing well and reporting the news because they are my source of news.
Right, and I would
with
argue
the
that's
internet.
what we are, and that we are the local news in this equation, right?
Yes,
Like
but
our Main
without
Street itself is trying to fill that void because I don't know how you get a sustainable local news source, because you need the advertising revenue and this, the subscription, right?
but I'm talking about it more in a theoretical framework, kind of based off the question of are we better off or worse
Yeah.
off? That's kind of where I'm going at it, is probably better off if this was occurring in a vacuum in the best case scenario, right?
Sure.
Without the internet. I personally am less, because of the way the algorithms work, there aren't opposing viewpoints. Like one of the things that makes Arming Main Street great is we can disagree with each other, right? But it's not like oh, Connor's a terrible person, Kendall's a terrible person. And we agree on a set of facts. We might interpret them differently. Like we might look at a poll or we might look at something that happened and say, here's how I would go about solving this, right? Or doing something about this. Whereas most people, yeah, I mean, they're just stuck in silos, and I'm not quite sure how you break them out of it.
I think that's the difference between having like common ground and like wanting to entertain that conversation versus just wanting to monologue, right? There's a difference between a conversation and a monologue.
To own somebody on Twitch, yeah, I feel like that's like the greatest political capital. I'm glad you brought it back to the algorithm though, because you mentioned that earlier. It's like silos into the algorithm. How does that work actually? Because I have been watching like a few Joe Rogan, videos to figure out how to, market our own podcast. All of a sudden, my next ones are like Ben Shapiro and Jordan Peterson. I know if I click on those motherfuckers, I'm going even deeper down that rabbit hole.
As OB, if you click on them,
So
how does that even work? I know, Connor, you've got a background in this.
Well, let me just explain it on the basis of what we're actively doing right now with Army Main Street, because I think that'll be very illustrative. Okay, Army Main Street. Right now, we're just on YouTube. The hope is to build up a channel of subscribers to about 1,000 or so before we drop officially as a podcast, right? Because we're hoping to gain momentum by making someone's PR best and noteworthy new releases, right? And this is based on your experience, Cass. So we're taking some of your knowledge. But what I'm trying to do is, having spent a fair amount of time as a digital advertising expert, focusing on smart bidding and conversion actions, which to most people are just going to sound like buzzword, 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 which just really means that I'm telling these algorithms to produce a specific outcome that I've determined, and then give it examples of when it succeeds so that it can use the data that was related to that success to basically create a bias so that it does more of that action. And so where I'm going with this is right now on Google ads right now, we're running YouTube ads. So we're showcasing clips of the show. We're showcasing some of the short form videos that you've been putting together, Cass. And right now, the first audience that we have it targeting are people who already engage with and like our content, right? So we're re-engaging them. These are called remarketing campaigns. This is to keep someone sticky in a part of your brand so that you're constantly top of mind, constantly in front of them, so that they will think of you and your brand when they do whatever it is that you're trying to have them do. And in our case, it is to watch our videos, to subscribe, and to challenge their own thoughts and opinions. How we measure the third point there, not really sure at this point in time. Right now, the KPI that I'm focused on is increasing our subscriber numbers. So that is what I'm pointing the algorithms at, is saying, go out and get me more people that will subscribe to us. Now, one of the other things that I'm doing is I'm not just remarketing to the people who've already seen our channel. We have to raise awareness and get it in front of people. And so what I've done is I've gone out and I've looked at people with controversial podcasts with strong brand loyalty and audiences like Ben Shapiro, like Joe Rogan, like Elon Musk even, who have almost these cult followings to some extent, who are media personalities more or less. And the types of people, the types of individuals who are subscribed to those media personalities actually make for perfect audiences for us, because the whole point is we're stirring the pot. Now, we want to be stirring the pot with useful information that actually helps people expand their understanding, as opposed to reinforcing whatever it is the bias we stand for. Joe Rogan or Ben Shapiro, in this case, standing for, some... Joe Rogan's really not the the worst on the far left by any means. I think he's more of a techno-futurist than anything, with some liberalism tossed in. But Ben Shapiro is clearly a hardcore traditional conservative. But in both cases, they have strong online media presences, strong audiences. And so what we're doing is we're taking advantage of the audiences they've already created, and exposing our content to them, and the individuals within their audiences that are willing to challenge their viewpoint or opinion are the ones that we're extracting out using these algorithms. And again, it's about finding a representative sample, testing messaging on those individuals, and driving them towards a certain outcome. The key here is the outcome, because the algorithms need to be optimizing towards something. That's what they're calibrating towards. On social media websites, it's calibrating towards engagement and time on page and time on site, because the longer they keep you on the website, the more ads they can show to you and the more money they can generate. In this case, as a media buyer, we want to get them off of these platforms and onto other platforms where our content lives, like our website, SoundCloud, YouTube. So that is where we're trying to drive them. And the key here to understanding these algorithms is they're a basket of people that you've defined by their interests, by their background, and by background, I mean, literally, it could be their ethnicity, it could be their socioeconomic status, it could be their educational background, it could be their affinity for certain brands like Mercedes-Benz or Tesla or Audi, whatever it is. And then, deciding, hey, does the, what do we call our newsstand on the website? I think it's a newsstand for the post-information age. So we're really just taking advantages of these algorithms, which really do nothing until you tell them to do something. It's a very much like a DIY kit for for finding people whose your message resonates with. And that's what makes them so powerful and easy to exploit. Is if your message is one of hate, is one of division, is one of whatever, you can calibrate the system to do that. We're trying to calibrate towards common ground and nuanced discussion, a much harder and probably costlier like endeavor to undertake, because that's going to be such a small subsection of the population. But we're taking our chances by targeting audiences that we know are highly engaged with this type of content already.
Yeah.
Because it's worth the risk. You know, at the end of the day, that's why we're here.
It's telling, though, that the terminology you use for that process is the algorithm creates a bias. Like, you know, that's how it finds your audience, but that's like the way it's being utilized right now.
Exactly.
And I think the other thing that's important to note is from an evolutionary perspective, human beings are infatuated, right, with the us versus them content. Because,
Tribalism.
yeah, because we always go back to it, right? Give or take several thousand years, I'm with my family, we chilling, and all of a sudden, my family is like, we don't like Kendall, leave. And now I'm out in the savannah by myself with gigantic birds the size of like men trying to eat me, along with cats with teeth the size of my face also trying to eat me. So we really, really, really like our groups. That's one. And we really tend to not like other groups. If Ezra Klein, who's now a columnist at the New York Times, has a great book called We'Re Polarized. And in it, he cites a couple different psych studies where literally if you take a class of 6-year-olds who all know each other, who've grown up in the same neighborhoods, have gone generally, been in the same area together, and you say this is the blue team and that's the red team, and you have cupcakes on the line. And if the red team wins, they get all the cupcakes and the blue team gets none of the cupcakes, right? And I'm paraphrasing the study, but the gist is the same. Or there's an option where if the red team and the blue team agree to it, they both will get the same amount of cupcakes because the teacher will go out and buy another 30 cupcakes just for each team. Typically what always happens is it's like, nah, I want it all and I want them to have none. And so part of it is unfortunately just human nature in the sense of that us versus them. That's why hate and things like that, the algorithm is there to reinforce a bias that is already unfortunately sort of seated in a lot of human nature.
And to me, this is what gets back to the issue with media outlets and their polarization and their, sort of unipolar view of things, right? Where they're only representing their bias and they're creating sort of the teams, at this sort of national scale. And they set up essentially the beginnings of the divide that have been exploited by these algorithms now. Because before there were only, 3-4 main outlets you had to deal with, and 3 were on one side and 1 was on the other. And, to what extent they were on any given side is obviously up for debate. Fox News being the one that's very clearly on the right. But, CNN tends to be the one that's most moderate, whereas, MSNBC, NBC, I'm forgetting what the other ones, they tend to lean more.
Yeah, to the left.
Much further. And, it doesn't really matter, but now with the fracturing through the internet, what we end up with is the fact of, Breitbart and OWN and, Vox and Jezebel, and I could go on and on and on because there's an infinite number of outlets, Army Main Street being the latest of them. But all of them purporting to have their own spin or take on the world that we're living in, and trying to build a tent of people to kind of come in under their banner and fly their flag and join their tribe. And so the algorithms, right, like they help with that process, help facilitate that process, and it is malicious in, you know, instances like Breitbart.
Yeah, I think with our show, right? Like you said, we're trying to find common ground, and I think most importantly, again, we can agree on objective truths. We don't sit and say we might have different ways of trying to solve challenges like climate change. We agree that climate change is a thing because of all the data and the fact that it's observable. One of the things that I feel has to be injected into this discussion, especially around algorithms, media silos, or the media silos they create, and fake news, and how easy that is to propagate that because of those silos, is quite frankly the fact that people's sort of lack of critical thinking skills, in the sense that, okay, I only know the world I grew up in, and if school or some other force does not push me outside of that, this is where I'm gonna stay, right?
What's the idea of like you stop learning after you get your high school diploma, your college degree, right? Like it's like, oh, you got your job, you're good. Now just finish out life.
Yeah.
And I feel like we kind of lose that constant like education, honestly, or gaining new information, learning a new skill.
Yeah. And the exchanging of ideas, right? In a way that's constructive. And that's obviously what we're trying to do. The fact, and this really scares me, I think the fact that our education system is so weak also lends itself to people literally ignoring what their own eyes are telling them. So in the case of folks who are anti-vax, right? There's numerous reasons why somebody might come to that. What is beyond me is millions of people have gotten the COVID vaccine. Have millions of people died? No. No, your own eyes are telling you something and you refuse, right? And so there's a lot of that, I think, that is also a part of this, where there isn't sort of any amount of observable facts that will make people budge anymore. And I don't know if that's because we've gone, frankly, in my opinion, too far with the individual freedoms, or because of a weak education system, or what that is about. But that is why people get into these silos, and then they're so susceptible to just straight up lies that they can observe and see aren't true.
Sorry, perspective, honestly. Like if you're saying, oh my God, 6 people and 1 person died from getting blood clots from like a vaccine, that's a little scary, I'm not gonna lie. But you have to keep perspective, and like in this situation, it's 10 million people vaccinated, and 6 out of those 10 million had severe complications, right? And if you look at statistics of everything, you're going to be able to find that like negative outlier, and it's very easy to hold on to that without keeping the perspective of the whole argument.
So, you know, piggybacking on that, because I think this kind of gets to the larger question you were posing earlier, right, Kendall, about we need to have some sort of common set of truths or facts to have these conversations upon.
Right.
And the reality of it is that statistics is such a powerful mathematical science and language for explaining and extrapolating problems because of how nuanced they really are. And what we tend to do as a society or journalists or media outlet or think tanks or whatever is we seek confirmation for what it is that we believe is the problem. And we use statistics to support that, because more often than not, when you look at the data, you can find support for 2 completely opposed, you know, stances. And it's right there, black and white in the data, right? But It's the interpretation of the data that allows those things to be different. And I don't mean it more so like we walk away with two different opinions on like a single data point. It's about why one data point is more representative or more important on the discussion than the other, right? And that's where the discrepancies really lie, is the fact that Ben Shapiro's going around and saying, no, look at the data, look at the facts. If we don't separate these things out on identity, but we do separate them out on identity without any context, we see X, Y, and Z happening. But slicing the exact same data set, slightly differently, you end up with a completely different narrative or conversation that goes directly opposed to what Ben Shapiro is just saying. And he won't give you, a single breath of air to, call out that nuance or detail, because he's such a expert debater, which just means he can steamroll you faster than you can get your, thoughts or opinions out.
Oh, I think we might have lost our guy.
Lost a mid-rant.
Yeah, mid. This is just an exchange.
I can physically hear him in the other room. It's pretty insane. Still going. There he is.
Don't let him know.
Wait, out.
Yeah, you went out
About like 30 seconds.
Yeah, mid rant.
Okay. Well, anyways, long story short, Ben Shapiro,
Yeah.
Yeah, recap. Ben Shapiro has statistics to back up what he's saying. He's a reader mostly because he doesn't let you explore the nuance at all. And, at the end of the day, his stats are still real. How do we have conversations here with people who, have this malicious intent almost? And I don't want to necessarily say malicious intent. I mean, with him, I believe it most likely, but, then again, benefit of the doubt, I don't know the guy. At the end of the day, he's still pushing a viewpoint. That's his goal, and that's what he's doing, and he's using data to do so.
Yeah, and I think that's such a good point about data and how easily manipulated it can be. That's why when you have bodies of evidence about certain things, right? The vaccine is just a perfect one. 10 million people get a vaccine, six people out of 10 million, something happens. And people are like, nope, not getting it.
There's more blood clots from birth control medication, and they still haven't figured that out. They're like, you guys are fine. You'll be okay. Yeah. I mean, perspective.
Right. And I would add things like, fine, don't get on a plane, because if the plane crashes, which is like a 1% chance, you're probably gone. Don't ever get on a plane. Don't ever get in a car. Don't ever do anything, right? If you're going, people, like you said, look for stats to confirm the biases they already have. And we no longer, and maybe we never have, I don't know, but I can speak, I think, for our generation, or my viewpoint on our generation, is this country has lost, for the most part, the ability to observe things as, okay, this is what my eyes are seeing, to challenge your own assumptions about life and grow from it, right? Instead of just remaining siloed. I get on my parents all the time about that. Well, it's like this. And I'm like, have you ever looked that up? Have you ever read about it? Well, no, that's what your grandmother told me. My grandmother had a 9th grade education and was a cotton farmer. Like, come on. Like, there's got to be more. And I am naturally like this. I came out the womb asking why, right? Like,
we all did. Yeah, absolutely.
I think that's why we're all here, honestly.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And so you have to ask more whys instead of just settling.
I know for a fact my parents, see me as a thorn in their side a lot because of all the times I ask why and challenge the rules of the questions that they were posing. If they listen to this today, I'm sure they'll feel the same way, though. Like, reflecting on it, like, the feedback that they gave me after the first episode was more so like, I don't think you're really delving into the nuance or issue here. And I think it's just because we didn't necessarily fully acknowledge their perspective or viewpoint. But that being said, they're viewpoint is maybe outdated, and that's kind of what I was trying to get across, but it's not coming across respectfully. And that's part of this whole internet culture of inflaming and clickbait to get people to pay attention. Where do you draw the line here? And this is getting wildly kind of off topic, but it's still very much on topic of trust in institutions, right? Is that we live in a world where news and information needs to be delivered to us in an infotainment style setting, because we refuse to pay attention to it if it's not interesting to us today. And what's interesting to us today is loud, obnoxious, controversial, ultimately, hopefully seeking to reinforce our biases on some personal level, but at the same time, the controversy is what draws us in.
Yeah. No, I actually
from here. Sorry, what do we do with all this information? How do we gain better perspective? What do we do in the current time to get us better than we were today?
I mean, ultimately, kind of two things to follow up to both of you. One, I think that's perfectly on topic as far as what's the line, and I would argue that line is objective truth, not being intellectually dishonest about it. Ben Shapiro is a great example. I listened to a podcast of his where he literally said the plight of Black people today has absolutely nothing to do with Jim Crow and nothing to do with redlining. It is all about the fact that culturally Black people are not where they need to be, and therefore they themselves must adjust their culture as a community and get better. That's just intellectually dishonest, right? That's it. I don't think I'm being, out of bounds by saying, of course, slavery and Jim Crow and redlining might have something to do with poverty rates in the African American community. I don't think I'm being, wild, right? But in saying that, I'm just saying a lot of folks are intellectually dishonest. And then to get to Maddie's question, at least on my end, I think the adults, nothing we can do about it. They are what they are. I don't think there's even, frankly, to me, it's not even worth wasting the time trying to get a lot of those folks, because the odds of success are slim. I'm beefing up my education system. Kindergarten, if you slap another kid in kindergarten because you got upset, you're writing an essay, even though you can barely write yet. Getting people to be self-aware and then constantly having an exchange of ideas, reading a ton more than we read, which I know no kid would like, but there are probably ways, and an educator could probably speak to this better than we can.
Podcasts.
Right?
I mean, I feel like there's a lot of ways to get new information. It's just how do we find those sources?
Yeah.
Currently.
And curate them in a way that
right.
really helps kids develop those critical thinking skills. Right. And that frankly, just that lust for knowledge and the wanting to challenge their viewpoints. That won't always happen, but I think if you caught more of the next generation coming, we would be better off. Adults today, I think that's kind of a done deal. Every once in a while, you hear of somebody that was a QAnon supporter that was comes around and was like, oh my goodness, this is insane. But that's rare.
Well, what I think it is, and from the reading that I've done on it, it really tends to be in instances where they're able to have these one-on-one moments with someone who has been in their shoes or position and is able to communicate it to them. So it's not a very scalable endeavor. So that's, I totally agree with you in that it's somewhat a lost cause because you have to dedicate so much time on an individual level. And we kind of heard rumblings about this early in the pandemic after George Floyd murder, because so many, people of color are fed up with having to educate white folks constantly on, the history of, risk, discrimination and racism in this country, and how those different aspects of our culture have infiltrated law and politics to create certain outcomes that we constantly see, and then we claim not to understand. But I think, what I want to like kind of touch back on is what you were saying about Ben Shapiro and, academic or intellectual integrity with approach to these discussions. I don't disagree with you on the disingenuous nature of the approach there, right? But I think there is something that to be said about the fact that social sciences are very much just that, is that we're trying to apply science to something that we don't have consistent hard numbers or metrics to evaluate against. And so when you look at something like Jim Crow or slavery, right, we have to make certain correlations between, the relationship of those events and the outcomes that we're seeing today. And in the same way that you can make correlated connections to those events, you can also then point to culture and say, no, it's not these events, it's culture. And I, as someone who's, read quite a lot of a bunch of different topics, totally see how that's academically disingenuous in this instance. Right. But there are plenty of instances that I may be blind to it. Right. And that others are blind to it because they're like, look, the data is pointing here. How is this data any different necessarily than this, the data that relates it to slavery or Jim Crow?
A great example of that, and I'm loath, right, to agree, but it is true. When the protests around George Floyd's murder were going on, and there were tons of people in the streets, a lot of them without masks. And we kind of just acted like COVID didn't exist anymore for a moment, where it was just like, let's just let people like march and it's okay. It was intellectually dishonest to tell people like this is fine, because it was not fine during a pandemic to gather that way. Now, if we had said this is really not okay, but we feel this is important enough that we're going to throw caution to the wind and protest for change, that's a different thing, right? Than just kind of being like, that COVID thing, it's cool, but this protest now, this is fine from a public health perspective, and it was not. So yes, I agree with you. There is that nuance. I just think we have so many bad actors in the space, right? People just trying to make money. And ultimately, I think that's what a lot of this is. I think some of these people believe it, right? But I think most are just trying to maximize the amount of dollars they can squeeze out by being as inflammatory as possible. And it's unfortunate because, like with so many different areas of our society specifically, we don't punish people for seeking short-term gain at the detriment of social cohesion, democracy, climate, like our future as a nation and frankly as a planet. So, ultimately that's the unfortunate truth.
And I think that all just gets linked back to Wall Street, honestly, because the short-term incentives around stockholders and stock prices seems to drive most of our problems, directly or indirectly. The influence in elections comes down to money being spent on campaign ads, which come from corporations, not individuals, who are lobbying for a specific set of outcomes. And, we can, wind this all back, but it time and time again seems to end up at Wall Street's doorstep.
Yeah. What were you going to say, Maddie?
Oh, I was just wondering if that was just capitalism in general, is the self-interest of making money at everyone's expense.
Yes, I think generally the problem is that we don't have a true capitalist society, and we brought this up before, where we let places fail. So hey, Lehman Brothers, you want to be idiots and give mortgages to people that probably should not get this mortgage based on their financial situation, and instead of steering them in a way to help them better their financial situation where they would be more stable, you gave them the mortgage anyway. And then when they defaulted, everybody looked around as you quite literally helped tank the global economy. You should have gone out of business. Every company that went bankrupt that didn't save any money for a rainy day should have gone out of business, period. And because they didn't, right? Like we're not operating all with the same rules. Oil and gas. Sorry, you should just die as an industry because you're not useful anymore, and that's capitalism. But
hey Texas, winterize your grid because you could maybe, I don't know, encounter a snowstorm that might take it down.
Yep. So there's just all those different things, right? Where we subsidize the sort of excesses of capitalism at the expense of everybody else.
Absolutely. Capitalism with a social perspective, I feel like, is where we need to ultimately go.
Yep.
Feel free to chime in.
Yeah. I agree.
So let's take this into a future-looking standpoint for a minute, because Cass, we've been kind of having discussions about this, throughout the week, right? We're working on a company to help artists and creatives basically own their medium work. That's our Project Vogue. That's Madison Jessica, our MVP artist website. We're trying to utilize blockchain, which allows decentralized, sharing of information and trust to power, different new age technologies, essentially. And so in the case of, creatives, and in this case, journalism, right, the way we were discussing it was to be looking at, all right, we want to be able to help people both identify what the facts are and what the opinions are, because it's very rare in journalism that you get a pure factual piece of information. Now, I don't see that inherently as problematic if the viewer or the reader or whomever is informed about which aspects are data and which aspects are opinion, and what that opinion is, backed up by. Is this because of your personal identity and your experience, or is this a paid viewpoint from sort of some larger brand, organization, or perspective? And what I think we see with traditional media outlets, they're seen as gatekeepers. They have an editorial staff and set of standards that allow certain articles or certain viewpoints to be filtered through and others to be mellowed down and transformed. But in the world of blockchain, you could potentially create an economic system where journalists are free to do all of this so long as they follow maybe a framework of organization for their information that allows the reader to actually engage with the content more meaningfully, and also allows journalists to act as their own editors or peer reviewers to check malicious actors or malicious data sources. Now, I know that that's like very fanciful and out there, and this is kind of like an ongoing discussion we're having. And, we want to try to make some of these topics we discuss more actionable, but this is something we're actively exploring. So one, Kendall, I'd love to hear kind of your initial thoughts on this idea in light of the discussion we're having. And then Cass, if you've added any additional thoughts since we've checked in on this, I'd love to hear what you have to say as well.
Yeah, I think ultimately it's tough, like you said, to have sort of these like super strong takeaways, go do this. But I think from a business perspective, right? Like what we are trying to accomplish, in a sense, it provides an avenue to be super transparent because of the very nature of the product itself, which is very rare, I think. And in fact, I can't think of any examples off the top of my head. Does that kind of make sense in the sense that the transparency of the data, like it is just pure data, it is unique, and I mean, I'm sure it's corruptible, but that's very, very hard to do. So it is trust. It inherently has trust to it. Mm-hmm. And so that in a sense really helps.
It's somehow like a balance between, how do we not censor anyone and allow free speech at its ultimate, without, allowing malicious actors to hijack the system. It's a conceptual problem to have to work through. I think an aspect I also missed is the idea that also brands or outlets would be putting bounties on topics for journalists to go out and write under with their full perspective, as opposed to today they get assigned a perspective or to be unbiased, but inherently bias creeps in. So I almost, passing this over to Cass a little bit, where does this become feasible? Where does this go off the rails? Is this even worth pursuing as a concept?
Definitely worth pursuing. It definitely is a little high concept as we talk about it now, but what I just wanted to say to kind of bring this all full circle, you said earlier, the like QAnon converts or whatever, the way that happens is one-on-one conversations. That is a hard thing to scale, but it's exactly what we're doing right now, and we're giving other people the access to join in on that conversation. So yeah, we're looking into a ton of different ways to bring that up to global scale eventually, but right now it's us, remotely chatting with our little backgrounds, and like that's good enough for now.
That's fair. We'll continue to explore this concept. Just a shameless plug here, for the ideas and the businesses we're trying to promote. I guess on that topic, though, real quick, because I think we're getting to the end of the conversation here. Speaking of like one-on-one engagements with individuals, I had a really, I don't know how I'm going to describe this conversation I had on Facebook earlier this week with an individual. His name is Chris. But he came at us hard on on one of our Facebook ads in terms of accusing us of not being anything but another centrist outlet, and that we're arming people with nothing but bullshit. I'm paraphrasing what he was saying because it was kind of hard to follow his line of reasoning. I don't know, if he was using speech to text. He shared with us a video where he was claiming to be a disabled person who was blind. Not gonna say whether or not that's the case, because I would have no way of knowing that. But he was against the American Disabilities Act on the basis of taxation being theft, and he wouldn't want to participate or acknowledge a system that allows this theft to occur. I tend to be on the side with him about taxation as theft, mostly because I think the government squanders the money and doesn't even use it for what they purport to use it for, but that's a separate topic of conversation. I was taking issue more so with the fact that it didn't appear that he was actually listening or engaging with the content. And he actually openly admitted that by saying that he was turned off by the first 5 seconds of the conversation, which I'm not even sure what it was, and by the name itself. And we were just exchanging back and forth quite a bit about how I just sort of had a spoon-fed view of the world that wasn't challenging anything. And, my pushback is, no, we're trying to highlight the incredibly nuanced nature of these discussions, because anything simple like a conspiracy theory is just bullshit because it's easy to make it out to be that. Whereas the truth is so much more complex because of the interwoven nature of our society. And ultimately, I feel like I walked away from that conversation frustrated and irritated that I couldn't convey to him why he should give a shit about what we're talking about and how it's different than what he's saying. At the same time, I can't blame him because there's this messaging disconnect. And this is something that I'm hoping we can figure out as this conversation goes on, because we want to open our tent to everyone to challenge their current understanding of the world. And, I think getting back to the taxation and stuff thing, where I view it as different is like, look, 80% of the world that we live in, validates and upholds the United States government. So whether or not I personally think that the government, is stealing from me doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things, because they're the authority and enabled to do so. And my protest of them, however small it would be as an individual, doesn't matter to them in the grand scheme of things. So I was like, basically, why wouldn't I, if I was this individual with disablements or a small business taking advantage of some other government system, why wouldn't I do that? Because if not, I'm effectively hurting myself by leaving money on the table to do what it is that I want to do. And to be fair, I've already paid into this tax system. So if anything, I'm just getting my money back out of it, and it reducing the theft. But like that's besides the point. That's just me still lingering on to the fact that I can't get over this conversation. But how do we start to bring this conversation down to that level?
So I think, one, I just want to say, arming people with knowledge is a part of the platform. The other part of the platform is hopefully being an example of reasonable conversation to show that, right? I would think most people would think I'm the liberal between the two of us. I'm also really conservative because I freaking hate social media and I wish it didn't exist. Period. I think it's dumb. I really do. And there's nothing, well, I won't say there's nothing people can do to convince me otherwise. In my own view, I think it is dumb, right? Mm-hmm. However, just because I think social media is dumb personally doesn't mean that I am not, one, smart enough, and two, can't observe with my own eyes its importance in our society, right? Mm-hmm. And the same thing with, in the case of taxes, nobody likes paying taxes. I get it. Yes, the government is inefficient. I get it. Other options, please. Monarchies didn't work. They ended up with a lot of wars and a lot of people dead. Okay? Communism didn't work. All right? Democracy is generally what we got. So, yes,
until
we're going to
takes over.
Right. So until we do something different, this is what we got. And I just wish, instead of everybody constantly looking at systems and just kind of taking simplistic views, like you're saying, trying to actually wrestle with the complex nature of various topics. And that kind of goes back, bringing it full circle to what I was saying about education being key, getting people to start working with that early, right? Because all of these problems we're talking about are complex, and what we try to do is distill them down to these simple things, buzzwords, headlines, and it's not possible. It's just not possible, right? And even people coming from left or right, that is born of people's own lived experiences as well. So all of this is complex, and we need to teach people to wrestle with that complexity. And ultimately, I hope that our podcast helps people see that in dealing with that complexity, you don't have to hate people. You don't have to call people out of their name. You can have a strong opinion, like social media is dumb, and still acknowledge its importance in our day-to-day lives. Now, that doesn't mean I'll ever send a tweet, but that's just what it is. So that's kind of the hope ultimately.
Kendall, if you do, we can sell it as an NFT.
True.
His one and only tweet. Fuck Twitter. Well, I think that's like the perfect way to put a cap on this, though. I think you couldn't have summed it up better. So for this week, we'll probably just end it right there. Tune back in for next week. I know last time we talked about going into healthcare with our friend Davin. Wasn't able to get in touch with him. We'll see if that happens anytime in the near future, but we'll figure out what the topic for next week is. So stay tuned. Also, we need to start doing this because this is a best practice. Subscribe, like, comment, please. This is the only way to grow. I sound like I'm harping on that and I hate it. So, just whatever. Fuck you guys.
Don't have to say it as much. Yeah, keep arming yourselves with knowledge. In the meantime, I'll catch you in the next one.
Kendall, where can we find you on Twitter?
You can't. Well, I had a Twitter. My last tweet actually was Michigan basketball Heck yeah, go Spike was my last tweet. As in
Spike
Spike Albrecht.
Albrecht. That is
Shout
a
out.
throwback.
Shout out to him.
Was that 2014?
Yeah, I don't remember. But basically, I don't tweet because I see no point.